Power rarely collapses at the moment it becomes weak. More often it collapses after decades of believing its strength still holds, decades in which every fresh advance quietly consumed the balance that made the original advance possible. Few relationships in modern history reveal this pattern as clearly as the rivalry between German and Russian power across the 20th century. It began as calculated caution, hardened into open contest, and ended in a fracture from which neither authority fully recovered its former coherence. What follows is not a story of two nations. It is the story of one ambition: the German drive to dominate the space between itself and Russia, expanding, hardening, and finally breaking against the scale of what it tried to control. The pattern began under Bismarck, whose foreign policy after 1871 rested on a single premise: a unified Germany could not survive a war on two fronts, and so Russia had to be managed rather than confronted. The Reinsurance Treaty of 1887 formalized this caution, binding Berlin and St. Petersburg into a fragile neutrality neither fully trusted. German industrial and military strength grew steadily through the 1880s and 1890s, while Russia's own imperial administration expanded eastward and modernized unevenly under the Tsarist state. Berlin's general staff, led by men such as Alfred von Schlieffen, began treating the Eastern question less as diplomacy and more as logistics, a problem of railways, mobilization timetables, and the speed at which Russian manpower could be brought to bear. Authority still functioned through careful balance, but the instruments of that balance were already being replaced by instruments of calculation. Behind Berlin's diplomatic caution, the German officer corps had already begun treating Russia less as a neighbor to be managed than as a variable to be measured, a shift in posture that outlasted any single chancellor. The lapse of the Reinsurance Treaty under Wilhelm II in 1890 removed the restraint Bismarck had built. Russia moved toward alliance with France. Germany moved toward a strategy assuming eventual war on both fronts rather than one avoided through diplomacy. Provincial garrison commanders along the eastern frontier drilled for a conflict their governments had not yet declared, absorbing the tension of a policy shift they had not authored. When war arrived in 1914, the German High Command executed a plan built for a Russia it expected to mobilize slowly. And when that assumption proved only partly true, German forces found themselves committed to a two-front war their entire prior strategy had been designed to avoid. Expansion of ambition had quietly become entrapment by circumstance. Regional garrison officials along the frontier absorbed the consequences of that shift before Berlin's diplomats fully registered it, adjusting supply requisitions to a strategy whose assumptions changed faster than the paperwork meant to support them. The Eastern Front's early German victories at Tannenberg and beyond reinforced a dangerous conviction inside Berlin: that Russian power, however vast, was structurally brittle and could be broken through sustained pressure. That conviction hardened further after 1917, when revolution removed Russia from the war entirely, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk delivered German authority an occupation zone stretching from the Baltic to Ukraine. It was the widest reach German power would ever hold in the East. It was also, historians would later observe, an accumulation the German state had no lasting capacity to administer. Occupation troops governed territory whose populations owed the new authority little loyalty and less predictability, and local officials adjusted to directives issued by a command structure already buckling under the Western War it had never abandoned. Germany's collapse in November 1918 erased the occupation almost as quickly as it had been won. But the underlying pattern did not disappear with defeat. It reappeared, transformed, within a generation. The Rapallo Treaty of 1922 briefly restored a colder, transactional version of the old balance. with German and Soviet officers quietly cooperating on military development each state's treaty obligations forbade in public. That cooperation dissolved as ideology hardened on both sides through the 1930s, replaced by a mutual suspicion that German rearmament under the new National Socialist government did nothing to ease. Officials on both sides of the frontier continued administering trade and border arrangements negotiated under a friendlier premise, uncertain how long the current posture of hostility would hold before hardening into something neither government had yet declared outright. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 revived the old logic of managed neutrality one final time. A temporary partition of the space between the two powers, understood by both sides as convenience rather than trust. That convenience lasted less than 2 years. In June 1941, German authority attempted the conquest the Kaiser's generals had only glimpsed. A war meant to seize the Russian landmass outright, rather than merely neutralize it. The early campaign advanced with a speed that seemed to confirm every assumption Berlin had carried since Tannenberg. Army Group Center approached Moscow by autumn. Provincial administrators in Berlin's newly occupied eastern territories drafted plans for permanent resettlement before the campaign had secured a single winter. Local commanders on the ground, meanwhile, absorbed supply shortages and stretching front lines that planning documents drafted months earlier had not anticipated. Authority had expanded far beyond the logistical structure meant to sustain it, and the distance between decision and consequence widened with every mile east. By the winter of 1941, the campaign had stalled outside Moscow. By the following winter, German forces found themselves encircled at Stalingrad, a single city whose fall had never been strategically necessary, but had become, through months of accumulated commitment, impossible to abandon without conceding the entire premise of the campaign. Field commanders requested permission to withdraw while the option still existed. Permission arrived when it arrived at all, structured around a political need to appear undefeated rather than a military assessment of what remained possible. Soldiers holding forward positions endured winter conditions their command structure had refused to plan for, absorbing a rigidity that treated retreat as a greater danger than encirclement. Behind the front, rear echelon administrators continued processing requisition orders for a spring offensive that the encircled army would not live to join, the machinery of planning outlasting the situation it had been built to manage. The Sixth Army's surrender in February 1943 did not end German power in the East. Armies remained in the field for 2 more years. Administrations continued issuing directives, and occupation structures persisted across occupied territory for months afterward. But the belief that had driven a century of escalating ambition, that Russian space could ultimately be subdued through sufficient force and sufficient speed, did not survive the winter that broke it. Authority continued operating. It no longer operated with the confidence that had built it. Power rarely disappears all at once. More often, it survives long enough to discover that expansion and control were never the same thing. The German drive eastward crossed, in the space of 2 winters, from ambition that still believed in its own momentum to authority that could no longer restore the coherence it once held. What ended at Stalingrad was not merely an army. It was the century-old conviction that had sent it there. If this exploration stayed with you, you'll find more on timeless questions.